When I shifted back to security, I became a lot more diplomatic. I assume I did not know how to fix anything. I offered help versus telling people what to do. And I carried over my personal experiments of trying to tackle security from the beginning.
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the MyDevSecOps community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out mydevsecops.io to join the community and find other great resources. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk is a dev-first security company helping companies fix vulnerabilities in open source components and containers without slowing down development. Join us in October for SnykCon 2020. It's a free multi-track event designed to help development, security, and operations teams accelerate the development of secure software. 100% of the proceeds will benefit the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. To learn more, visit snyk.io/SnykCon. On today's episode, Guy Pajani, president and co-founder of Snyk, talks to Sacha Faust. Sacha has held several security roles across the industry since the late 90s and focuses on automating offensive and defensive security decisions. He is currently leading the Security Intelligence Group for Amazon Payments.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning back into The Secure Developer. Today, we're going to explore the different levels of security or sort of perspectives of security in different companies with Sacha Faust, who has a really interesting journey through security roles in different companies. Sacha, thanks for coming on to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
So, Sacha, before we dig in, tell us a little bit about, what is it you do and how did you get into security? Just a little bit of the synopsis of the journey.
I currently lead security intelligence in Amazon consumer payment. What that means is I don't do fraud. I'm focusing more on generating a fast learning flywheel in security by managing red team capabilities, threat hunting, threat intelligence, and trying to be a helping hand into the IR functions as well. So that's been my focus this year at Amazon. How did I get into security? I got into the security field pretty early in my career, I would say around the mid-90s. Doing kind of early on pen testing. I got into security because I thought it was a good problem space. I used to play a lot of video games and then realized that computers have a much broader sets of games that you can play. So a lot in the chatting with the networking back at the time. And then somebody just recruited me and says, hey, we're trying to build a consulting business to do pen testing against hospitals and financial systems and so on. Why don't you come in? So that's how I got started. I worked through a broad sets of company early on consulting, got a little bit of polishing and cutting my hair and cleaning up at Pricewaterhouse for several years, which I think was a good experience for me. And then decided to move into a couple of startups like Web Inspec, SPI Dynamics that got acquired by HP, did quite some interesting work there. And then spent some time, I would say a decade, about 11 years at Microsoft, working on the early Microsoft Online service like SharePoint Online and so on, and kind of revisiting how do you take flagship products that are on-premise and adapt them to cloud? Like, what's the multi-tenancy concept there? And gradually moved into developer. I shifted my career into pure development and help build some of the things that are now called Office 365s and Azure Active Directory to learn distributed systems, just kind of polish some skills, and then went back in security and helped lead red team thinking in Azure, and then shifted to Lyft, more of a breadth role to head security for Lyft, and then now back to, I would say, Brett role into consumer payments at Amazon. So kind of tiptoe all around the industry.
Yeah, no, there's definitely checking all the boxes there. You've got a security vendor in SPI Dynamics. You've been in large sort of security sensitive setups like, Azure, and today in Amazon. You've been in sort of a fast growing hypergrowth company in Lyft, as well as the developer experience kind of in there. Let's unpack some of those. Mm-hmm. So maybe what we can do is we can focus on steps in the journey. Maybe we talk about Lyft, where you headed security. What does it mean to do security or to head security at Lyft? What's the perspective you need to successfully do so?
The thought process and sort of the mission statement we had at Lyft, and Lyft was a great way to experiment from the beginning, hire very senior people, and the grass is green, right? So you don't have established process and things like that. So the mission statement for security was, how do we inform Lyft to make informed and automated security decisions, right? So handling security there was let's try to avoid pitfalls that we've seen in the past around sort of a dictatorship approach of like, you must do this, and more into an empowerment approach so that we enable the decision makers to make their own decisions and dive into like true accountability is, as a service owner, you are accountable for the A to Z of your service. We are a center of excellence to help you. So it was one is an experiment to sort of dive into meaningful kind of relationship with stakeholders. And the second part was like, how do we scale this thing? Because we're moving at an absolutely insane pace, sort of in the very, very fast growth, right? So handling security was interesting, moving a lot more into stakeholder management. Do not dictate. We do not sign off. We recommend. We guide you. At the end of the day, the reality is even if security orgs are signing off on things, service owners will either overrule you or make their own decision, as they, in my view, should do. So managing that was pretty interesting. And then navigating through fast scale, really focus on hiring builders and have a very thorough hiring process. What you need are smart people. Smart doesn't necessarily mean intellectual horsepower, right? It's like interpersonal relationships. How are they thinking deep? Are they have a strong sense of ownership and so on? And really having the builder mode. That's generally sort of the experiment of Lift Security in the early days.
And do you feel like that's an advantage or a disadvantage? Like when you think about these significant ownership, but empowered team that can overrule you or run, if you contrast that maybe with surroundings where it sounds like that was a bit of a change maybe from the reality you came in Microsoft. Is that a positive or a negative?
I think that was a good positive. You can look at it two-way. Either it's overwhelming or empowering, right? Overwhelming is like, hey, there's no infrastructure, there's nothing done, right? Or not at the bar that, for example, are well-established with a big bullseye on their back like Azure is, or even Microsoft. The second thing is empowering. You can actually solve problems in a very different way without having any historical or territorial battles or, existing sense of ownership there. So you're left to kind of a clean slate, so you can do things in a more optimal way. From a culture perspective, you get to define the culture, which is what I was focusing on a little bit earlier around the mission statement. How do we make decisions, right? Now, onboarding people from other companies, like large established companies and so on, it's a little bit of an adjustment. You are not telling people what to do, you are guiding them. And it's just a tweak in communication and a tweak in sort of the metrics that you look at and so on. Let me give you a concrete example, right? Is security imposing a fixed SLA. At the end of the day, who are you to dictate how they operate, right? So if you're saying, when we're looking at the sort of security SLA and look at compliance aspect, and I looked at the engineering SLA were generally in par with compliance. So decision makers, like, why don't we actually gather the security debt, provide meaningful information back to leadership in terms of, hey, these are the security debts that are out of your SLA, right? And surface this up. And then here are the ones that, we're probably probe even further and trying to move away from hypothetical threat to more real threat with some exercise. And here's the ones that we've surfaced. That's the type of mindset where we are sort of empowering them to make good decisions. And then they come back to us as like, oh, well, how can we get better? And how do you grow your org as well? It becomes more kind of a stakeholder management at this point. Hey, they're informing us, we need some help. Okay, we're willing to help you, but it will cost X. And then suddenly what you're realizing, gradually you get funded in a smooth sort of ride there. That was the experiment, I would say, at Lyft. That turned out, it's a fast-paced company. There's pros and cons, but generally I think it worked well and we had a good culture there.
Yeah. So you're coming into this sort of Lyft surrounding and, you've got, I'm imagining, a decent number of areas that require investment. How did you choose what to take on first?
That's an interesting challenge, and I think a continuing exploration on my end in terms of the prioritization aspect. At the end of the day, the customers are going to tell you what they feel important, right? You may agree or disagree with it. Doesn't matter. You are a servant to them, and you should provide value to them. So how we pick and choose, it was also kind of adapting to us in terms of what's really important for them. And I found the engineering phase is defined by some folks, I forgot his name, some person at Facebook, around the explore, expand, and extract phase of engineering. It made sense to me. And when I was looking at the investments that we had, this is not just, for example, focusing on Lyft, this applies to broad sets of companies that I've worked at, is what's really important at each phase, right? So if you have a security engineer, if you don't mentor your security engineers in that way. For example, if you're building autonomous vehicles that you're trying to bring to market, and the security engineer is only focusing on, here's the scenario of people pointing specialized lasers to your LiDAR, are you really kind of giving them value to get to market? Now, if you're not asking those types of level of questions in a payment infrastructure, are you really giving value back? Probably not, right? So in both cases, like, you have to make informed decision there. So around the prioritization is really go ask the customers, and customers are your engineering teams, may have other customers as well, but your true customers, like the people consuming the product. What is important to them? What are some of the metrics? Is fraud a problem? Can we educate them to improving the security of their own device? Can we actually automate that so that you build kind of a more solid security aspect? Around scale, are they making good decisions internally, right? So you can do education and so on, but how do you validate that, really solidify? At the end of the day, it's all about like very quick decisions. So attackers are playing the numbers game. So they blast you with a bunch of things. And very often what they're trying to do is generate, sort of forcing an individual to make a decision and looking for a favorable outcome, and then they play the number, right? So in terms of prioritization also is, you can try to prioritize all sorts of things, but if you prioritize the culture, things will move fast, and give them incentive, not just financial. I love one of the podcasts that said, you can throw money at it, but that's maybe not the right reward. Recognition is probably a lot more powerful. So we spearheaded some of these things at Lyft around, are they making good decisions? How do we validate this? An example of that is spear phishing, for example. A lot of people only look at who clicked on it. Now, how many people actually reported it, right? So you add that metric, it's like, okay, there's a decision there that we need to improve. We have security mechanism. I've seen a lot of security tools focusing on the perception and reality. Perception is, here's the coverage they report. The reality is they don't look at the usage. If this is not being utilized, what's the value, right? So be customer focused and look at scaling, and scaling in a way that drives a culture. I think people is first there. That's kind of an abstract answer to your question. There's depth to it, but generally that's what we try to do in a very, very fast-paced environment. Now, in larger, more mature spaces, it's completely different. You have like requirements and a bunch of, especially in the fintech, you have your strong compliance that you got to meet, and that's business enablers.
Yeah, for sure. But it's a very, very kind of good perspective, I feel, playing to the advantages of a fast-growing startup, which is you have these empowered teams, you have the opportunity to build things into the fabric, whether it's culture or technology, to kind of help make a bunch of these problems go away. And you need to prioritize sort of speed and agility because needs change and you have to move along with them at a faster pace. Maybe they might be an established company.
The main thing for me, or if I sort of can resume when I looked at this, is how do we drive accountability in the right way and clear the room in terms of, I see a lot of teams, for example, defer accountability back to security. Security sign off on it. Well, the reality is you gave 1% of the information there. We're not making informed decision, right? Mm-hmm. So I am not the approver of this. I'm a guide, and showing the security engineer responsibility matrix and see where do you feel fit into that was kind of a powerful message from a coaching perspective. Is like, well, the reality is you fit here, not there. You're not an approver, for example. So that's how we try to navigate sort of the fast pace. I would say the lessons learned are definitely applicable in larger companies. How you tackle it and the level of patience is a little bit different. You have to look long-term versus like short-term changes.
So let's dig into that. Fascinating period there at Lyft, but you also had worked at Azure and now at Amazon. How is that different? So how do you sort of consider the security needs, or what does it mean to do security well in those types of setups?
There are different targets. So we're looking at the cloud infrastructure, let's say financial infrastructure, much more mature, much larger teams, established process. It is very difficult to change a process. You have to have a good idea why you're changing it. Do we have some level of inertia or lack of proactiveness in certain areas? How do you navigate making that change in a fast way, but also diplomatic way? The infrastructure and the process are already well established. It's about fine-tuning things versus creating things for the most part. The baseline is there. Now, how do you tackle unknown, for example, is an area that you're going to spend a lot more time in those established environments versus the less mature is like we're just trying to get up to speed and just getting the baseline done, right? tackling unknown is an interesting one. I think generally assume breach, be humble, realize that whatever you have in place might fail, like, and apply the fault modeling mindset is like, do you know that this is failing and can you recover? So I would say larger environments, much more focused on automation, large scale systems. If we're thinking about kind of the Lyft environment versus, let me just give you kind of ballpark employee numbers. You're looking at a 10,000, 15,000 employees versus over 1 million. It's a just very different scale from a human aspect, but also from an engineering, like how many things you have. So the larger environment is a lot more depth focus. You are hired to really do special things and focus on that. And everything you have to do needs to scale. So the level of experiments is a lot more challenging, I would say. Yeah. So I would say that those are the main differences. And the corporate chess is more complex, I would say.
Yeah, it might be more stakeholders and kind of more history to navigate when you're trying to drive some change.
Absolutely.
We talked a little bit about the sort of breadth versus depth, and maybe, I don't know, this in the Amazon specific, or it could be your general experience. When you think about security problem and you think about going deep, what does that mean to go deep, when you tackle a security risk?
Specific to security risk, for example, the why of a bug, right? Let's call it like you found an issue, for example, and you call it a risk, you call it a bug. There's difference of opinions on this depending on who you talk to. If you talk to engineer, it's bug. If you talk to risk management, it's risk. They're both saying the same thing, but very often they don't agree. So that's a different topic. So let's talk about like you found, let's say, I think a good source of bug, for example, is a bug bounty, which is an interesting one because that's provable. So going deep on a bug, one is like, what is the nature of this bug, right? And what sort of information can you get out of it? And then there's also questions in terms of what is the true fix of a bug? So let me dive a little bit more deeper on this. Going back to the thought process about providing information to decision makers is you have a bug, but let's avoid the doomsday thinking by default, right? So I think a lot of security engineers say, oh, doomsday, they can align the moon and the sun and all the planets to come up with that outcome, right? Or you can use the CVE type risk rating, and it gives you kind of a baseline, but that's not contextual. So you have to add some context to it, to the business. So quick questions are like, is this known externally? Do we have any evidence of this being exercised against us? Is there an automated exploits for this type of bug? So going back to the bug bounty is you can already prove that it's externally found, which is one of the things I found super valuable there because it cuts that conversation. It's not internally found, they found it externally. So right away it lit the bar because you've proven that somebody else can figure it out with limited knowledge of your infrastructure, right? Now, is this bug being exercised against us? I see a lot of people shy away from answering that question because it involves a more thorough sort of root cause analysis of a bug, which very few teams are actually doing. Like, how did we get here? So I think stimulating that investigation or building the muscle to do this at scale is an interesting aspect. It is something that I think you should look at. The second is like, why are we here today? So going deep onto at least 5 or more layers of why is hypothetically, and what I've seen from team missing is that thoroughness. So asking the good questions of why. Why does this bug exist? And the answer cannot be, well, we screwed up from an engineering perspective. Okay, why did we screw up on the engineering aspect? Is there quality control in place? Yes. Did we had the expectation that these types of class of bugs should be found or identified early on in a pipeline? Yes. Okay, then we have a failure there as well. So very often a single bug expands if you do a proper root cause analysis, and they are expensive to do. So maybe you do a sample once in a while and so on, depending on the velocity of your team. But going deep at that level, sometimes it's a lot more important to go fix the quality bar, right, faster than go fix the bugs. Because if you go fix the quality bar, what you'll realize in experiments I've done in the past with solid static analysis like SEML, for example, that allows us to model bugs like patterns at scale, is there's probably 10, 20 instances of them. Go fix those, right? And they may be in more critical systems, like apply the tier model of the service, right? So go deep there. That's what I mean about going deep, is really kind of squeeze out as much learning opportunities of that sort of quote unquote bug failure and turning into an impact that you measure. Now, let me dive very quickly on the definition of fix. A fix can be a code change, but when do you close this bug, right? So do you close it when the fix is coded? Do you fix it when the fix has been deployed? When is that? And when you start looking at the metrics there in terms of what is the velocity of your fixes and you painting an accurate picture, what you might find is that you think that the issue has been resolved, but it's only been resolved in code, never been deployed. Or it's been deployed partially in one of the service slice, or it might be only in testing, right? And when you start measuring that, you might find that there's significant gaps in terms of the reality versus perception. Perception is fixed, reality is not. And sometimes there's a logical reason. If you're looking at high velocity teams like Lyft and kind of the newer engineering fresh from start, you tend to have a faster velocity. And there's some chaos approach of resiliency, terminate everything every 14 days. And so it may give you that agility. If you look at larger systems, kind of a cloud provider, fixing a bug at the sort of kernel of the infrastructure of the cloud may take several months for a very good reason. You have to do workflow migrations and so on, right? So deep dive into what the real fix is and look at, for example, the real fix, which is kind of the code fix, may take 6 months to deploy. And you've made a decision of the severity based on like who's potentially, do you have evidence that this is being exercised against you? Do you have threat intelligence that this is being sort of exercised in the wild? As a security owner, my thinking is that we should inform the decision makers based on those criteria if the criteria are changing, right? And potentially prioritize more the detect and response aspect, and the protect, which is basically just the fix itself, may take a lot longer. So once you start diving into those types of metrics, you might have some surprises there in your environment.
I love the deep perspective really on so many dimensions here, right? You mentioned an understanding of the depth of the risk, understanding if it's severe, if it's exploitable, if it's being exploited. Talked about going deep on the origin of it. Why did we get here? What was the missing security control or engineering control that kept us from finding and preventing this bug in the first place? And then you talk about the rollout of the fix. I love that approach. I think I often get asked, what's the best place to put security control to flag a known vulnerability? And it's like, well, there's no one place that is a superset of the others. If you're closer to the code, you're closest to the fix. You can find those. If you're in the pipeline, it's probably one of the better preventative controls. You can put it there, you can break, you can disallow something to get through. And if you're monitoring what's deployed in production, you're closest to the facts, because as you just pointed out, it might take a while to roll things out. There might be a line that isn't quite straight from source code to deployment. Somebody might, even if they shouldn't have, approached the production system and sort of modified it after. And so each of these things presents a complexity. I love how you're saying if you go deep, eventually you'd probably have a more robust system, but it's an investment and it's an effort.
Oh, absolutely. And how do you do this for all of them? Maybe you take a sample. It depends on, fast-paced company will have less time, but they also move a lot faster, I would say, in a fix. It was interesting for me to come from a high enterprise engineering focus with quality bars in Azure. And Azure is the only financially backed SLA cloud provider, right? So when you start digging into how did they get there, it's pretty interesting. And then you go to a fast-paced environment where they deploy at will several times a day. And it's really an approach of fail fast, learn fast, which doesn't align very well with enterprise engineering, right? So it's a little bit kind of a shocker for me when I moved into this, but then I kind of enjoyed it and learned quite a bit about go deep on the root cause. So the one thing I would say I appreciate, I used to call it the family sort of dinner conversation, which is our weekly root cause of failures at that company. And as a family, you fight, but it's to improve the house, right? Yeah. And I've absolutely enjoyed the thoroughness that they went through, and it took the time it took. And that's how you fail and learn fast.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a larger environment, the volume of those signals are much greater. So I think you have to figure out kind of a way to sample and prioritize, but not avoid doing it.
So I think we can probably kind of go on and we can go deep on this specific topic, and I think it'll be still good. But I want to dig into one other aspect of your background. So, we talked about the different companies that you were in and the different security perspective, maybe, or some anecdotal pieces of the difference in thinking about security in each of them. But you also had a stretch of time in development. And I was curious, especially given the audience of this podcast, which kind of straddles this world of security and development, how impactful do you think that development experience has been to your ability to do the security role, to understand these things to work? Does it matter? Does it not matter?
That has worked for me, right? So that's all I can say. And it has worked for me in different ways. I think diversity of experience, I always encourage people to do that. And many years ago as a security engineer, I felt that I didn't own fixing things. I was just giving guidance, kind of got a nod from engineers, right? And the body language at times were like, yeah, whatever, right? So I didn't feel sort of, am I making a meaningful impact in this conversation, or am I seeing as like kind of a roadblock that needs to be bypassed? And some engineers were very good at that. So, and I also wanted to learn how do we solve these large scale problem, distributed problems. So it was a personal choice. And I love Microsoft giving me this opportunity of lateral movements in my career, an opportunity that may have been a lot more difficult kind of coming in at the front door, right? Is moving in distributed systems and working early days in the Azure Active Directory piece, which is like very, very complex. That, and then going through the security view myself, right, on the other side of the fence, and not telling people my background, right? They saw me as a pure engineer and so on. And looking at how I was approached, looking at the questions, looking at the you must do approach or we know better than you approach, right? And I was like, yeah, I guess these are a good recommendation, but have you even thought about the fact that this is sort of a stateless system? Implement cross-site request forgery many, many years ago on a stateless system at a scalable way where a session can be distributed across a large scale problem. It's pretty interesting, right? So it definitely helped me kind of build up this empathy of like, oh, okay, this is actually what the work looks like on the other side. And kind of understanding also the areas of friction I had before without really understanding or even realizing. So, hey, this is just a one-liner code change. Okay, this is one-liner. Well, we need to write unit tests for that. The money is actually in unit tests very often. So we have to write unit tests for that. Oh, okay, we don't have a mock layer for this. So that one line of code, if you do it, especially at the enterprise level, where fail fast, learn fast is not necessarily what the goal of the business is, you should not be failing, period, right? In enterprise, because there's major consequences to that and you lose business and so on. So building up that empathy of like, oh, it's a lot more complex, and also working with very talented people on the engineering side really kind of up my game from an engineering and says, that's how you kind of design it at scale. Going back when I shifted back to security, I became a lot more diplomatic. I assume I did not know how to fix anything. I offered help versus telling people what to do. And I carried over my personal experiments of trying to tackle security from the beginning. I carried this at Lyft, and that's why certain decisions were made when I was there. I think they're generally carried since, but I would say it definitely helped. And it also helped from my own team, because if you're looking at doing red teaming, for example, at the scale of cloud providers, the real problem is scale. So I carried over the distributed systems into building or at least leading teams that are heavy engineering flavored that can actually scale to the need of the customer, right? So if you're doing automated testing and scaling at cloud provider scale, what we ended up building is kind of a system that allows for a security engineer and the specialist to kind of model their brain and build it into an automation system, right? So that carried over, I would say, on both sides, both from an empathy and also actually scaling teams very, very quickly.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think it was clear the empathy or maybe that perspective when you were talking about Lyft and talking about hiring builders, talking about having the servant mentality and building those out.
So regardless of sort of my personal experience moving into dev, the general guidance I tell people, both from a career and also how to build teams, diversity is king. So go wander elsewhere. Ask your management. From a manager, go send your people, embed them into engineering projects if that's the route that they want to take. Having diversity of experience, both in your team and people, but also work experience, has been, for me, extremely valuable. And I always look at building teams that have that diverse set and tapping to it, which bug bounty is a crowdsourcing, but a tremendous value and diversity. We learn a lot from those. So that would be my general guidance, regardless of my personal route.
Yeah, that's great advice. I was actually just about to sort of say, as our conversation here, tons of goodness in it, but I think we're kind of running a little bit out of time. I was just about to sort of ask you that as we close off, I like to ask every guest for, if you have kind of one bit of advice to give a team that is looking to level up their security foo, above and beyond. You just offered sort of two great tidbits around sort of a diversity and that bug bounty. But still, if I squeeze one more out of you, if you have one bit of advice that you haven't mentioned yet for a team looking to sort of level up security powers, what would that be?
Aim towards self-enablement. right? Work your way out of the task that you're working on, right? So look really at an empowerment approach versus a dictator or telling people what to do. Enable them to get there first. Taking a quote from a previous manager, Isar at Lyft, there's a certain degree of benevolent dictatorship that needs to happen. Pick your battles, but generally work towards an empowerment culture versus maybe the word dictatorship is inaccurate, but kind of telling people what to do. Help them out.
I think that's great advice. And I think you've even given all sorts of examples about why that is valuable as we're going through it. Sacha, this has been great. Thanks a lot for sharing the sort of multiple perspectives, tons to think of about as we come out. Thanks for coming onto the show and sharing.
Oh, my pleasure. This was actually pretty fun for me as well.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. And I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. For additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit mydevsecops.io. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved with the community, you can also find us on Twitter at @mydevsecops. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.